Hey guys, today we're going to do a little comparison shopping and I'm going to pit two camera systems against one another. Sony versus Nikon. And I'm going to speak in terms of camera systems because I'm really not comparing specific individual cameras so much as I am the entire system that you buy into when you buy one of these cameras. Because if you're getting an interchangeable lens camera, presumably you're going to be getting some lenses and you're kind of buying into an entire network of products and services. I'm comparing Nikon versus Sony because these are two systems that I'm very familiar with. I want to speak today specifically about Nikon DSLRs and position them against the Sony E-mount line of mirrorless cameras. I'll pose the choice to you this way. Nikon is a longtime optics and imaging company. Sony is a company that focuses on technology and consumer electronics. They both make great cameras. They simply approach the task and the product from a slightly different perspective. And I think the end products reflect their company's history and sensibilities. So I want to start out with Nikon. As I said, Nikon has a long history in the optics and imaging business. And they were building lenses from pretty much day one. The branch of Nikon which is involved with lens production is called Nikkor. The most important upside probably of owning a Nikon camera body is the huge library of Nikkor lenses which you have to choose from. For example, here's an excellent vintage Nikkor lens. This lens is probably about 40 years old. This is a 135mm f2.8 lens, and it's built like a Sherman tank. It's built mostly of metal and has a built-in lens hood. The glass, even after 40 years, is still pretty much pristine. The images are sharp even on modern sensors. Even though there's no autofocus or vibration reduction or special coatings on the glass, it's still a great lens. This is a wonderful portrait lens. You know, in the last 20 to 30 years, Nikon's released many excellent lenses that have autofocus, they're sharp, even on modern sensors. And not only do you have a lot of lenses, you've got a lot of great inexpensive choices. For example, this 50mm f1.8 that I have attached to my D750. This is the D version of the lens. It has an aperture ring, made mostly of plastic. It doesn't have some of the niceties of the modern G series Nikkors with regard to some of the lens coatings and even the design. However, it's a really sharp, really fast, really inexpensive lens. With Nikon cameras, you can pretty much outfit an entire system for less than $1,000, hitting many different focal ranges. In other words, you could pick up a 35mm, a 50mm, an 85mm that are excellent with a bright f1.8 aperture and autofocus, all for less than $1,000. If you're a sports or wildlife shooter, the telephoto options for Nikon are outstanding. For example, last year they released this 200 to 500mm f5.6 that I reviewed here on YouTube. If you want to get the modern G series lenses, you can. If you want to get exotic telephotos like the 800 f5.6 or the 500 f4, you can. If you want to get cheap telephoto lenses, you can pick up some excellent 55 to 200mm or 70 to 300mm lenses for a couple $100. It's not going to cost you an arm and a leg to put together a pretty complete system with Nikon. The Nikon bodies, we're talking about digital SLRs here, use a traditional imaging setup in which, without getting too technical, light comes in through the lens, bounces off a mirror, and reflects through an optical viewfinder. So what you're seeing is the image that's passing through the lens, reflecting off a mirror, and then going through a pentamirror or pentaprism so you can view it through the viewfinder. When you push the button to take a photo, there's a single reflex mirror inside that flips up and the light passes through the lens and hits the image sensor. In the old days it was film, but now it's an image sensor and records the photograph. Nikon DSLRs have really excellent focusing systems, and if you're photographing birds in flight, sports and action, then you're going to be pleased with the focusing systems that are available to you with some of the premium Nikon bodies, because the DSLR focusing abilities are second to none. When Nikon says their bodies are weather sealed, you can believe it. I've used these Nikon bodies outdoors in the rain. I've used them standing in front of waterfalls when I'm being pelted by spray from the waterfall, and my cameras have gotten thoroughly soaked, and knock on wood, I've never had a problem. Nikon battery life is excellent. You know, you can have your camera turned on and it's really not using much power at all. A lot of these Nikon batteries are rated at 800, 900, even 1,000 shots per charge. If you're working at an event, or for that matter, if you're going overseas and going on a trip, you don't need to worry about packing a whole lot of batteries, and you don't need to worry about recharging your battery very often. So that can be very liberating. With a Nikon, you can just shoot. Nikon has been slow to embrace certain technological advancements, like Wi-Fi, for example. They're doing it now in their cameras, and they're kind of finally getting up to speed. But for several years, they kind of lagged behind in the Wi-Fi arena and in connectivity. So it was just a little more difficult to connect your Nikon seamlessly with your cell phone or tablet to share photos with friends on social media and what have you. Nikon has not really always been a technological leader. However, the technology they do use, they implement very well, typically. There's a little bit of a secret sauce to Nikon cameras in their image processing. They can use the exact same sensors sometimes that Sony uses, because Sony is a huge sensor manufacturer and supplies sensors throughout the camera industry. Nikon has used Sony sensors in the past, but the results you will get from shooting a Nikon camera will be a little bit different, even if it's using the same source Sony sensor. And I think it has to do with just Nikon's secret sauce image processing and whatever tweaks that they do to modify the sensor. That's Nikon, an optics and imaging company. Now let's take a look at Sony. Sony is kind of an upstart in the digital camera business. Now, they've been making digital cameras for almost 20 years. In fact, I have here my original Sony Mavica. This camera is almost 2 decades old. Yes, I'm dating myself here. If you think your camera is crappy, whatever you're shooting with, trust me, it's better than this Mavica. This Mavica was, well, it's sort of a piece of junk. But at the time, it was incredibly sleek and cool because it recorded images to a floppy disk. So we had removable storage media, which was pretty much cutting edge tech. This recorded images that I believe were like 640 by 480 pixels, so kind of less than 1 megapixel. You talk about poor dynamic range. This Mavica had horrible dynamic range. And I don't know why that I hang on to some of these old digital camera bodies, but it's kind of fun to look back and to think about how far we have come. Because from the 1997 digital Mavica, we have an Alpha 6000 here, circa, I don't know, 2014, I think the A6000 was released. 11 frames per second, 24 megapixels, excellent dynamic range, smaller, lighter, records to SD media, all the modern advancements, and just wonderful little camera. So this kind of shows how far that we have come, and Sony's actually been making these cameras for a while. Now, Sony's roots as a company go back to the 1940s. If you think back to the 1970s, they kind of invented the first portable music player with the Walkman. Sony has always been at the forefront of technological innovation and applying it to the consumer electronics space. So something really significant happened about a decade ago, and that's when Sony bought Konica Minolta. Minolta was an optics and imaging company with roots back to the 1940s. And so Minolta had a very successful imaging division. Sony bought it, and they inherited the Minolta A-mount. So suddenly, when Sony swallowed up Minolta, they became a much more formidable player in the photographic world. And about 5 years ago, Sony sucked me back into buying their digital cameras when they released the E-mount line of cameras. And these are mirrorless cameras. And I have here the Sony Alpha 6000, but my first Sony mirrorless camera was an NEX3. I have another channel here on YouTube called Long Honeymoon. It's a travel channel. And my most popular video that I ever created here on YouTube so far was shot with a Sony NEX3 camera. It was shot on the Queen Mary 2 crossing the North Atlantic. And I'll put a link on here if you want to see that video. The video was shot 100% with my Sony NEX3 that I purchased in, I believe, the spring of 2011. So what Sony has done, and other manufacturers have done this too, it's just Sony has done it particularly well, is release a series of cameras that are mirrorless. They did away with the flapping single reflex mirror, and that allows them to build much smaller bodies. Some of the bodies are also lighter, but the bottom line is the bodies are generally much smaller, have a much smaller footprint. And now the camera is taking the information straight from the lens onto the sensor and putting it into a viewfinder that's electronic. In the early days of mirrorless cameras, and by early days I mean about 5 years ago, these electronic viewfinders were kind of a liability. But in recent years, the electronic viewfinders have improved and have become kind of a strength. With an electronic viewfinder, you can do all sorts of cool things. First of all, you actually see the image in the camera before you snap the shot. With an older optical viewfinder style of camera, you have to take the picture and then review the picture on the back screen to determine if your camera settings are up to snuff. With these newer cameras, you see the image before you press the shutter button, if you get my drift, because you're seeing the exact data from the sensor instead of seeing through an optical viewfinder. So it may sound confusing, but when you first use a mirrorless camera, you'll figure it out. Sony cameras have improved in focus over the years. The very first mirrorless offerings from Sony had pretty poor autofocus. It was kind of a contrast autofocus. In recent years, Sony's introduced phase detect autofocus with their cameras, and the bottom line is the Alpha 6000 has a focusing system that is comparable to a DSLR focusing system. It may not be quite as adept at tracking action as a DSLR, but the point is Sony's focusing technology gets better with each successive generation. I think pretty soon autofocus for each series of camera is going to be roughly equivalent, whether you get a DSLR or get a mirrorless camera. But for the moment, for right now, I would say that DSLRs still have the edge. With each successive generation, Sony has gotten better and better because, again, they're a technology company and they've kept the pedal to the metal in pushing the technology of these cameras. Like this Sony Alpha 6000, that's what 11 frames per second sounds like. And it's using the same sensor that a Nikon D7100 uses. So Sony's appeal was taking exactly the same sensors, which are large APS-C and full frame size sensors, and cramming them into small bodies. So these Sony cameras make great travel cameras because you get a large sensor in a small package and you can take it with you just about anywhere. They're also a little bit more discreet. They don't attract maybe quite as much attention as a traditional Nikon body. Sony has also push forward pretty aggressively with Wi-Fi integration into their cameras. Sony's Wi-Fi app is simply more full-featured than Nikon's offerings. They have some really great apps that you can use, like so you can download and install apps on your cameras just like you could your phone. I don't trust the weather sealing of the Sonys as much. I don't really trust the bodies in terms of their build quality as much. I have more faith in the longevity of a Nikon body, even though in recent years Nikon's had a lot of trouble getting products out the door that are error-free. I still have a little more confidence in the build quality and construction of the Nikon products. Nikon has a little better reputation with regard to service and servicing the cameras of professionals than does Sony. Sony outsources its camera service, and I've heard a number of horror stories about Sony camera service. I also question the longevity of Sony lenses. I've seen some teardowns of Sony lens products. I simply don't have a whole lot of faith that the lenses are going to be around in 40 years and still be used and still produce the same quality imagery they do today. I hope I'm wrong. With Sony, you're not going to have exactly the same large catalog of lenses to draw from that are first-party Sony lenses. However, due to the electronic viewfinder of the Sony, they play wonderfully with vintage Nikons. Once you pair a vintage manual focus Nikon with a modern Sony body, you'll see what I mean. And I'm talking about all the niceties like focus peaking, and then on the modern Sony full frame bodies include in-body image stabilization. So the sensor is stabilized. So you have stabilization and you have focus peaking, which basically uses the electronic viewfinder to tell you and show you specifically what parts of the image are in focus. So I find it much easier to use vintage lenses on my Sony bodies than I do on the Nikon. One of the beauties of the Sony E-mount system is the short flange distance means you can use these cameras with just about any lens that's ever been built. So if you have a stack of old Leica lenses, then maybe you should get a Sony. With regard to Sony's lens library, in recent years, they have really pushed aggressively to expand the library. And I would say at focal lengths below 100 millimeters, Sony has pretty much got you covered. There are a number of wonderful Sony primes. There are first-party Sony prime lenses. There are Sony Carl Zeiss branded prime lenses. And I have 2 or 3 of these, and these are fantastic lenses. Carl Zeiss has also released the baddest line of lenses for Sony cameras, and those lenses have all received glowing praise from anyone who's tried them. Sony video is wonderful. These E-mount cameras are really true hybrid cameras. They perform very well with all video tasks, and one of the reasons that I love my Sony E-mount cameras is their versatility for video. Again, it comes back to Sony's expertise in building consumer electronics. The lack of a flapping mirror really helps with autofocus apparently, and Sony cameras simply will do some stuff that Nikon cameras won't. So what's the downside to Sony? Well, perhaps the major downside to Sony is cost. You know, in the first few years of the E-mount, they were practically giving these bodies away. I bought several E-mount bodies for relatively cheap because I was buying the previous year's model, and that's how they kind of sucked me into the line to begin with. But some of these Sony lenses can be quite expensive. For example, this Carl Zeiss Sony E-mount lens, this is the 55mm f1.8. This has an MSRP of around $1,000. And on my D750, I have a 50mm f1.8 lens. This is the D version, and it has a retail price of right around $100. So is this Carl Zeiss branded lens better than this Nikon? Yes. Is it $900 better? That is a matter of debate. Sony battery life is a weakness of the E-mount system. The batteries themselves are smaller, which gives you lighter weight, that's a plus, but they're rated for more like 200 to 300 shots. One of the reasons is these Sony cameras, using the electronic viewfinder, using Wi-Fi, all this stuff eats up a lot of battery life. If you are going into the Sony system, you might as well budget for extra batteries. Fortunately, these Sony batteries are available cheaply in the aftermarket. You can get, I think, 2 for 20 bucks. If you're planning on taking a trip with the Sony camera, you just need to plan on bringing several extra batteries. It's probably worthwhile to get a half dozen and bring with you. I believe if you are into sports and telephoto shooting, you still have to stick with the DSLR, because Sony has been slow to release lenses in the longer telephoto lengths. There really aren't any exotic telephotos that are native to the E-mount line yet. If you're shooting outdoors in inclement weather, I would get a Nikon. If you're a professional and you need professional service to your cameras, I would probably get the Nikon, because it's simply a more reliable overall system. There's more longevity, there's more lens choice. If you're on a tighter budget, get the Nikon. If you're in video, go Sony. If you're wanting a lighter weight camera, particularly one with a smaller footprint, go Sony. If you've got a little bit beefier budget and you're willing to fork out for some premium Carl Zeiss glass, then get into the Sony system. I'm really brand agnostic. I like both these camera systems. I don't think you can make a bad choice either way. The question is, which one will work best for you? And it all depends really on what your needs are with photography. Thanks for tuning in, guys.
If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you disliked it, give it a thumbs down. Feel free to leave a comment. And of course, don't forget to subscribe.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Who Gives a F?